Howdy! Thank you all for coming tonight. Questions of right, wrong, good, and evil are some of our most profound. For many people, God plays the central moral lawgiver in their life. And this raises a concern that if God's not true, if God's not real, if we don't have God in our lives, how can we truly have a solid foundation for our moral beliefs? As Nietzsche once said, morality has truth only if God is the truth, and it stands and falls with God. Could this fear be overblown? Do we really need God for morality? This will be the discussion for tonight. I'd first like to get started by thanking both the Association of Former Students and the Christian Faculty Network. Without them, this program simply could not have happened. They provided a lot of pivotal help when we were in need, and very thankful for them. The host for tonight's event is the Texas A&M Secular Student Alliance and Ratio Christi. I myself am the president of the first. Nathan Turner right here is the president of the latter. Let's see. Both of our organizations really seek to create events that stimulate provocative thought, discussion, things of the sort. And we really try to bring people from a diverse set of backgrounds, beliefs, ideologies, et cetera, together to have meaningful, fruitful discussions, very much like what we're trying to do here tonight. When you came in, you would notice that you were handed both a pencil and an info card. We ask that you take that out now and fill out the front side of the card. If you could just take a few moments to do that. Yeah. Good. Oh yeah, also on the front side there's something that says if you would like to stay in contact with Ratio Christi, go ahead and leave your email. Unfortunately, we didn't have time to put the Secular Student Alliance organization on there as well, so if you want to be on our mail list as well, just go ahead and write SSA or anything like that on there, and we'll go ahead and get you on our mail list as well. Yeah. All right, so kind of the style of this debate, or discussion more I should say, is we're gonna have opening statements from both of our presenters tonight, followed by a quick 10-minute break. We're then gonna switch into more of a facilitated discussion with Professor Garcia, not sure where he is right now, but he will be facilitating the discussion. And also, during any time during the debate, if you see the hashtag right here, if you have any questions that just pop into your mind, you don't have anything to write it down on, you don't wanna lose it, you can go ahead and tweet any of your questions to hashtag moralitydebate TAMU, and those questions will be included in our Q&A at the end of the discussion. I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce both of our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. John Ferrer. He's an educator and former associate pastor hailing from South Carolina. He earned his PhD in philosophy of religion from Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and is currently a teaching fellow at the Equal Rights Institute. He also runs the Intelligent Christian Faith blog, as well as volunteering for the Pella Pro-Life and local Student for Life chapter at Central College. Our other speaker tonight is Mr. Matt Dillahunty. Mr. Matt Dillahunty is an American public speaker, avid gamer, magician, and internet personality. Let's see. He was actually originally seeking to become a minister, but his investigation into religious truth led him to kind of eschew those religious beliefs, and he actually became very prominent in the atheist community over time. He now identifies as both a skeptic, humanist, atheist, and he engages in many formal debates, discussions, and the like, and tries to engage both those who he does and does not agree. We'll see. Let's please give them a warm round of applause. All right, we will now have our first presenter to come up and give a 15-minute introduction. Then we will have our other speaker come up, and we will get into the discussion then.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to move fairly fast here, but I think I've got a way to help you keep track. I'm going to give 3 arguments. Essentially, these arguments can be represented with 3 images here: a house, a mirror, and a doorknob. A house, a mirror, and a doorknob. The first image of a house refers to what I'm calling the cumulative case for Christian ethics. Since this is a moderated dialogue, I'm going to lay out a whole bunch of stuff, just kind of throw out a general case, which I couldn't possibly defend all of it meticulously in a 15-minute time, but I'm going to throw it out there so it'll be some nice provocative stuff for the Q&A period. But it's a cumulative case for Christianity. I refer to a house because in many ways I understand Christianity as kind of like Christian ethics specifically, but we could refer to theistic ethics and have a streamed down version of this. But Christian ethics as a house is kind of this place you could move into. It's a fully furnished house with lots of moral furniture that's been worked over through so many years of theologizing and philosophizing, and it's a well-furnished place so that it's ready to live in. And in contrast, the image I have of secular ethics is more like a barren desert. Now, I know if I just left it at that, that would look like an insult, but I'm going to try to make a case for that. So the cumulative case starts off with something that's not contentious at all. We should favor the overall better explanation. That seems like a good rule of thumb, generally speaking. The second one's really contentious. Christian ethics is a better overall explanation compared to secular ethics. And 3, therefore, we should favor Christian ethics. Now, here's how I'm going to defend number 2, because I assume that's the one people are going to contest. People can do good or even be good without having a strong account of all the facets of morality. That's a given. I grant that. Yet ignorance on these facets that we're going to mention is still problematic. For example, metaphysics, the nature of being and existence. Epistemology, what kind of a thing is moral knowledge? Moral psychology, referring to moral judgments and reasoning and moral motivation. And then normative ethics. These are moral systems like utilitarianism, Kantian deontology, and stuff like that. Social ethics, ethics applied interpersonally, and then practical ethics. This is boots on the ground, going out and doing good type of stuff. Now, how does Christian ethics fare? Painting with a really broad brush here, the metaphysics of morals for Christians traces back to grounding in God. We identify goodness not just by opinions or preferences or arbitrary outcomes of natural forces, but rather in a divine mind, which takes us to the second one. Realism, based in God's mind. Our moral theory, in terms of what can be known morally, we understand moral facts to be things that can be independent of human minds. Yet they're grounded in a divine mind. Now, that may sound like subjectivism, but we're referring to an unchanging and necessary mind, which as grounded as something could possibly hope to be. Moral psychology. The key here is moral agency. If people are forced to do everything that they do by biological or by theological necessity, then it's difficult to make the case that they're still morally responsible. But Christianity, at least major portions of it, allows for moral agency and free will regarding morally charged situations. And then normative ethics. There's several options here. I won't go into all of it, but I'm a fan of virtue ethics, natural law ethics, graded absolutism, and divine essentialism. And then socially, in terms of social ethics and practical ethics, Christianity, I would contend, fares better. For example, the abolition of slavery. I've done a good deal of research on this, and people love to point out abuses of the church in regards to supporting slavery in the American South. But when you do a broader survey across the history of modern civilization, you find that almost every civilization that has formally abolished slavery had to be thoroughly Christianized first, even though they all had atheists in some, almost all of them had atheists in some measure before that. But Christianity also played an instrumental role in helping Rome in the early centuries of this millennia, or of the first millennia, to abolish infanticide and gladiator games. And Christianity also served a formative role in helping to found the first universities and even some of the first hospitals. Now, how does atheism fare? I suggested it's a barren landscape. Now, you can survive in a barren landscape if you smuggle in goods from outside. Naturalism, that is the view of nature most common among atheists, consistently applied, is too barren to live in. Metaphysics, the answer to metaphysical grounding is a grounding problem, I suggest, which I'll get into argument 2. When it comes to the theory of knowledge, there's a circularity problem, which will be my argument 3. Moral psychology, biological determinism, though not every atheist I've met runs into this, many of them support determinism, which, if applied consistently, tends to suggest there's no real moral responsibility. And those that don't affirm determinism, oftentimes I interact with them, and their appeal to free will is kind of shallow, or they don't know how free will could have emerged from a mechanistic universe. And then normative ethics. When it comes to our ethical theories, many atheists suffer from a problem I call minimalist ethics, or lowest common denominator ethics. That's what the LCD refers to, where there's one or two moral principles that everything is supposed to revolve around, like liberty or pleasure, and some would incorporate an element of evolution, and that would refer to survival. But many times that's too flimsy to build a family or society off of. Ethics must justify self-sacrifice, hard work, courage, undying loyalty, and bold convictions, even sometimes martyrdom, if you're going to have a well-established, morally grounded kind of civilization. Social ethics, the landscape for much of atheism, and again, I don't want to say every atheist is like this, but the landscape is often too lonely. Statistics have shown a tendency towards lower marriage rates, higher divorce rates, and less community. I don't know if that's a correlation or a causation, but it's still significant. And then practical ethics. As I argued earlier, Christianity, I think, fares better. Number 2, so that's the house. It's a livable house as opposed to a barren landscape. Number 2, the metaphysics of morals. I want to point out moral facts. How do you tell if a mirror is a good mirror? Well, you compare it to the thing it's reflecting. Does it distort it? Is it stretching or shrinking it somehow? That would be a bent mirror. Well, moral facts are kind of like that. A fact is a fact only insofar as it correctly represents or correctly corresponds to its reference point. A moral fact, for it to be a moral fact, must correspond to its reference point. I suggest that nature doesn't have reference points that could make any of our moral claims true. Now, that looks like an argument form. Nature alone cannot make moral claims true and thereby factual. Yet moral facts exist. This is something that Matt and I have both agreed on, so I'm not going to defend that. I'll take it as a given. Therefore, nature isn't all there is. Conversely, supernaturalism is true, i.e., at least some sort of supernatural being exists. Now, a fuller treatment of this would take it into you need a sufficient mind to ground morality, and that would have to be closer to a divine mind than anything else. Now, I made the claim that nature doesn't have truth makers. Well, to make moral claims factual, there's a big problem for a naturalistic outlook, and that's the is-ought problem. How do you go from descriptions of how nature is, including humans, and we're part of nature unless you're a supernaturalist, how do you go from descriptions of how nature is to how anything whatsoever should be? Should is a hypothetical. It's not a material state. Should is not something that exists materially speaking. Naturally speaking, if you're a materialist, it doesn't. And yet, all of morality is statements of what should be or should not be, what should be done or should not be done. That's a pretty big leap to go from natural facts of is to moral facts of what should be. Moreover, science isn't necessarily going to bridge the gap by itself either, because science is a descriptive exercise too, not a prescriptive exercise. It's not saying, do this, don't do that. It's saying, if you want to survive, here's how to do it. If you want to save the whales, maybe here's some options to do that. But it's not saying you should want to survive, or you should want to save the whales, or you should do anything whatsoever. Number 2, appealing to evolution doesn't help very much, as that would render all morality trivial, arbitrary, and unreliable. Nature happens to have made us, according to a naturalist perspective, so that we consider rape to be awful, unbearable, evil. Wrong. Well, give it time. Nature could change. Nature could change us. Apparently, in animal history and perhaps human history, rape has been considered morally permissible. Or at least it has been common enough to be morally accepted, if not morally condoned. Atheism isn't a worldview. This is oftentimes beaten on theists. It's just godlessness. It has no commitment to morality. Atheism fits with every ethical outlook that happens to lack God belief. It can include philanthropists and charity workers, or sociopaths and criminal deviants. That's just how it is. Now, I gave you a reference to a house, a reference to a mirror, and now a reference to a doorknob. I'm referencing here a circularity problem. We were at dinner today, and suppose I excused myself from dinner and went to the bathroom and I did my business, washed my hands, and then turn around to face the bathroom door, and it turns out, oh no, this isn't a lever that you can use your elbow on. It's not one of those walkways that there's not really a door, so you just walk. It's a doorknob. And I happen to know that the doorknob in a bathroom oftentimes is the dirtiest thing you're going to have contact with in a bathroom. It's got all kinds of fecal microbes and germs and nasty stuff, snot and whatnot. And that's just how doorknobs are. So I turn the knob, and then, oh, now I need to go wash my hands. I turn around and wash my hands. And then I go turn the knob, and now my hands are dirty again. I've got a small-scale loop here, a circularity problem. Now, similar problems that might be more restrictive might be, for example, I can't get a job because I don't have a car. But I can't get a car because I don't have a job. I'm stuck. Or if you go to the movie theater and they're selling tickets at the drink counter, but they check for tickets at the front door. You have to present a ticket that you can't buy yet before you can get it. And so that's a circularity problem. I contend that the brain creates a circularity problem for secular ethics. The circularity problem in argument form looks something like this. We know some moral facts. To know moral facts implies a reliable means of knowing. Nature alone can't offer that because of the circularity problem. A famous guy with a white beard, I think Santa Claus said, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? I ran into this problem in discussion with John Loftus. John Loftus is an atheist writer. He wrote on Facebook, "Our brains lie to us because they didn't evolve to arrive at truth, but just aid survival." Well, I challenged him on it, and I said, can you trust your brain to tell you the truth about how your brain is chronically lying? That sounds circular. Sufficient objective evidence is a corrective here, he said. Your circularity problem is a concoction of your lying brain, John. Well, I was a little snarky. Did your lying brain tell you that? Should I or should I not trust my brain? Well, he tried to recalibrate and come at a different angle. He said, you don't have a choice anyway. There's no free will. He's a biological determinist. I said, your lying brain forced you to say that because you were determined. Do you see where the circularity problem comes? This boils down to something like, my brain is reliable according to my brain. So if we're just products of blind, pitiless material forces, then our lying brains are the only way we can know anything. But that lying brain also interferes with everything you might otherwise use to correct the mistakes of your lying brain. How am I going to look at the objective evidence that lets me know how my brain is lying to me? I got to use my lying brain to look at that objective evidence. And that's the chronic problem we have. And so going back to the argument, we find the conclusion that follows number 4, therefore nature is not all that exists. I suggest Christian ethics offers an improvement on this because we don't say the mind is reducible to the brain. We allow a soulish element that can offer some leverage that isn't stuck in the same material loop that all these brain problems are. And conversely, a supernatural mind exists. So if you remember the 3 images, we've got the house, the mirror, and the doorknob. I think there's a good case to be made for Christian ethics being morally superior, just being superior to secular ethics. Thank you.
Hi. He's wrong. No. Yeah, you're supposed to go with the joke, so I'll start with that. So is God needed for morality? Now, there's two facets to this question. 15 minutes, thank you. One is God needed for the motivation to do good? And the other is God needed for the foundation for good? Now, we're both in agreement we're not going to bother with the motivation. Obviously, he agrees that I can do good and non-believers can do good, so there's no point wasting time on there. So it's all about, is God needed to serve as a foundation for morality? And I find myself in a lot of debates tempted to say, well, the answer can't be yes, which is different from saying the answer is no. In this case, I can not only say that the answer is no, but I think that the answer is obviously no. Because the only thing that's needed for morality as a package is a desire to do good and a belief about what is good. Now, the secondary question that comes up after this is, how do you know that your belief about what is good is correct? And that's probably, I hope, where we'll spend the bulk of our time. But all you really need is a desire to do good and a belief about what is good. Now, this motivation being set aside, what about this belief? I believe this is good. Well, setting aside for a moment how I would go about figuring out what good is, isn't that enough? I mean, if we're stuck in this world and we have different views about what good is, how do we resolve those questions? How do we address this? If I think something's good and you think it's evil, or if you think something's good and I think it's evil, or if we're ambivalent about whether or not, it's good or evil, how do we know? How do we come to agreement? Now, in the many objections that people raise to secular morality, I'll point out that I'm aware of no objection to secular morality that is in any way, any real way, solved by appealing to a God. I am, though, aware of objections to theistic notions about morality that is, in fact, solved by secular moral systems. And I'm advocating for a very, I think, simple and simplified, which is free reign for everybody on YouTube to just say that Matt's too stupid to understand morality, and that's why he simplified it. But I think that morality ultimately is far simpler than we tend to make it. And I think that you can construct a moral system beginning with purely arbitrary goals. Because what we're assessing when we assess the moral valuation of something is the consequences of an action with respect to a goal. And for me, the goal is well-being. And the most common objections that, well, well-being isn't really well-defined. You're right, because we are still in the process of defining well-being. There's nobody, including theists, should be claiming that we have solved morality and we have a moral explanation for every possible situation. I am not a moral relativist, which means that I don't think that something is moral merely because your culture says it's moral. I think people can be wrong about their opinions and beliefs about morality. I am a situational ethicist in that I think all of the factors of a situation go to determine whether or not something is moral. And that in many cases we oversimplify it. Thou shalt not kill. Boy, that doesn't tell me a lot, especially if the same source is telling me to go kill people. It's not particularly helpful. There's a reason why we have a rather robust laws surrounding murder and involuntary manslaughter and things like that. But I don't want to confuse the law with morality, because we don't legislate merely on the basis of morality. Everything that is immoral is not necessarily illegal, and vice versa. So what I think religions tend to do is say, gosh, this is a really difficult problem. And I don't think they're necessarily doing it now, and I don't think that anybody's thinking this process, which you probably understood. But gosh, sorting out what good is kind of difficult. So we'll just say that God is good. Done. I've defined God as being good. I've offered no demonstration that God is in fact good. I just say that God is by definition good. And now not only have I solved the problem of a moral foundation, I've solved the problem of moral motivation. Hooray, let's go to the after-church dinner. God is good, and this also provides a motivation, because if you don't do what God says, he will mess you up. You will pay the price. You are now no longer consistent with what God views as correct. Now, we don't need for it to be the case that a God is real in order to have these views. All we need is belief that a God is real. If you're convinced that there's a God and you're convinced that God thinks A, B, and C about morality, and you care about doing what is good, you're done. Whether or not a God exists is kind of secondary. But it is important, and this will come up, I'm sure, as we discuss more with regard to secular morality. How do we know that God is in fact good? How do we know that what secularists are calling good is in fact good? Where is the demonstration? How do we find this? Now, generally I would say that if you define something, it would be nice to have objective criteria rather than just a bald assertion. And so what is the objective criteria that God is in fact good? For believers who believe in a good deity and an evil being of some kind, God and Satan, whatever, my question to them is always, how did you discover that God is the good one and Satan is the evil one? Well, God has written his moral code on my heart. Oh, cool. But that tells you nothing about whether or not it's good. It just tells you that that's the entity that told you that they're good. You're judging God by his own standards. If you judge me by my standards, I'll probably come out fairly shining as well, especially if I have exceedingly poor standards that would allow me to endorse and advocate slavery and misogyny and war and all sorts of things like that. If I place myself above the law, where the law applies to you, and so even if you find something that's inconsistent in my standard, it's only inconsistent in that you have to follow these rules that I've come up with. I'm not necessarily subject to those rules. So how do you build a moral system from the ground up? Well, fortunately, we don't have to do it. It's what we've been doing forever. John alluded to it in the sense that these are problems that have been reasoned out through theologians. If you take a look at Jewish history, they recognize that, hey, there's a big problem with the Torah and the Tanakh, and that it doesn't go far enough in telling us about how to live in this world. So Jews have been working on the Talmud to kind of revise the problems in the Old Testament. And there's a ton of rabbinical teaching that shows that they've gone through and said, you know what, this really isn't robust enough and it doesn't fit with our modern world and this is not right. So what did they do? They reasoned. And I applaud them for that. I think that they are doing what secularists are doing. They are reasoning. There's a reason, you can cite all day long how essential it was for Christians to help in the abolishment of slavery, and you're absolutely correct. But it doesn't change what the Bible has to say about slavery. The Christians who abolished slavery did so by cherry-picking other verses and ignoring the ones that specifically endorse owning slaves, beating them as long as they don't die within a couple days, a separate set of rules for Jewish slaves than there was for non-Jewish slaves. All of those things are in there. If you were God and you were truly the source of morality and you were truly good, and slavery, owning another person as property and beating them, if that was in fact immoral, as I think it is, then the only thing you could ever say is, thou shalt not own another human being as property. There's no way that you could not only not forget to say that in your guidebook, but it would be impossible for you to say or inspire people to say the exact opposite of that. Now, I'm not here to knock the Bible or knock Christianity. We're talking about the foundations of morality. And when I say that it's simpler than I think some people make it out to be, I like to use a chess analogy. I don't know how many chess players there are, but the rules of chess are arbitrary. We made the game up, and yet we still can assess positions and discover which moves are better than others because we have a goal of not losing the game. And that allows us to determine whether or not a particular move or sequence of moves is likely to lead to a better position or a worse position. And the fact that we don't know the absolute best move in any given situation does not mean that we are without any idea of which moves are better than others. Not having a perfect understanding of what morality is does not mean that you just toss the board aside, screw it, we're done, I'm not playing this game. If I can't get the perfect answer, I have nowhere to go. No, you know something about which answers are better and which aren't. And it's worth noting that in the same way there are chess experts, there are probably, and almost certainly, people who are moral experts, people who have spent a great deal of time evaluating the situations in reality to determine what actually makes the world better. And I'm advocating for good, well-being, as a foundation for morality. You could begin with, death is generally preferable to life, and you will find very quickly that this is not a good principle to start with because everybody dies off. So you flip that, and you say, life is generally preferable to death. And you do these as kind of guidelines, and you build it up from there. I can actually, with fairly simple beginnings, get to where we are now. In the sense that, hey, I like my stuff, and you like your stuff. It's probably in our best interest to protect our stuff and create a society that cares about protecting our stuff. But wait a minute, Matt. What in the universe intrinsically compels you to care about this? That's kind of a side question, because I don't think there is anything in the universe that intrinsically compels you to care about good or well-being, any more than there's something in the universe that intrinsically compels you to care about winning or not losing a game of chess. But we have to share space with each other, and by and large, I'm pretty sure that, is there anybody here, well, I don't want to poll the audience during this, but I would ask at another time if there's anybody here who doesn't care about well-being, doesn't care about trying to do the right thing or trying to find out what the right thing is. I don't think there's that many of them, and I think they've excluded themselves from conversations about morality. Oops, I scrolled down to something too far away. So, as I'm living my life, I want to do the right thing, and I want to find out what the right thing is. How do I do that? How do I know that what I think is the right thing is the right thing? Well, first of all, I'm probably wrong. Quite a bit. I was massively wrong on Sunday's show about something that I'm going to have to apologize for. I was an ass. It was awful. But recognizing that you're probably wrong is what allows you to keep pursuing the right answer. As soon as you say, God did it, whether you're talking about the origin of the universe or the biological diversity or morality, you're done. We're done. Because that's depending on essentially revelation. Now, how do you verify, how do you tell the difference between somebody who actually got a revelation from God and somebody who thinks they got a revelation from God? I wouldn't know how to tell that for myself. I certainly don't see how anybody else could tell whether or not my revelation has been true. And what benefit is it for anybody else? What we've done, what John has talked about doing with the theologians, I forget the exact language that he used, but it doesn't matter, we'll get to it later, thinking about these things and creating a more robust morality that is based on a God, based on what people say that a God wants and biblical foundations, et cetera, is the same thing that rabbinical Jews have done with the Talmud and everything else. And they're all doing exactly the same thing that secularists are doing, except that we're not beginning with a holy book and trying to say, this is the foundation, let's massage it until it fits what we've discovered to be true. We're beginning by saying we have the benefit of being the survivors of all these other people, so that I can now create a thought experiment in my head and say, what are the consequences of my actions likely to be? We know a lot more about the world than our ancestors did, and so we now can have a better understanding of what is likely to increase our well-being, what's likely to decrease our well-being, and how we can create a better world. How do I know if it's true? We're physical beings in a physical universe. Those physical laws dictate the consequences of our actions, and they also dictate our well-being. I can't survive without oxygen. That's just a physical fact. Depriving me of oxygen is bad for me. To the extent that we want to view this as moral, to the extent that we want to say, oh, you ought not deprive Matt of oxygen. The is-ought problem is one that I deal with in a number of different ways, but this one's fairly simple, and that is, you ought if. If you care about my well-being, you ought not deprive me of oxygen. Problem solved. If you don't care about my well-being, well, there's no ought there. And this is why I was saying earlier that I don't think the universe has any intrinsic ought that you ought to care about. This is the first objection I get when I talk about secular morality. Well, why should I care about well-being, Matt? What in the universe tells me I should care about well-being? Nothing. But you do. And you know you do. And if you don't, then we're not talking about the same thing. And if you want to say, well, when I talk about morality, I don't mean well-being, then we're not talking about the same thing. Because I care about well-being, I think it's a good foundation for morality. I'm going to try to find out what's good, and if it happens to lead me to a God being co-equal to good, so be it. But if it leads me to the conclusion that a God who exists is not good, or a God who people believe exists is not good, then I have no need of that God, because that God is not the foundation. You don't need God for morality. You need good for morality. And there's no demonstration that God exists or is good, which is why we get into philosophical arguments about a necessary mind that must do this because nature is insufficient. Well, I'm not convinced that nature is insufficient because I don't put extra impositions on nature. I don't have to nature doesn't have to have some intrinsic goal or purpose for my life or encourage me to do anything for me to have a goal and purpose in my life or to try to do the right thing. I don't need good, I just need God. And it's more than just one letter difference there. Thanks.
Did I say that backwards? Did I say that backwards at the end? Flip that. I'm not perfect.
All right, we're going to go ahead and take a quick 10-minute break and then transition into our discussion and then finally our Q&A at the end. All right? It went back to the original slide. You can probably find it. All right, we're going to go ahead and get into our moderated discussion, so sit back and enjoy.
Do you have to introduce it?
So I'm Robert Garcia. I'm a professor in the philosophy department here, and thanks for coming. My job is to moderate this exchange. I've been told that my role is really to be the liaison between Matt and John and you. So I'm supposed to ask, what kinds of questions would our audience be having? So if I hear things that aren't quite clear, or I feel like a term is not defined, I might interrupt these guys and ask them to be a little clearer. So if I do interrupt, it's only to push for clarity. Or if you don't answer the question, I might ask you to answer the question. So we're going to have 4 rounds of questions. The first question is just a request for a rebuttal. And you'll each have 8 minutes to just offer a response, anything you want to say. And then after that, we'll move on to a different question. So I think John goes first.
Okay.
You have 8 minutes.
I would do it from a seated position, except I've got slides prepared for when you brought up slavery. I did a extended presentation on it. Now, will it come up? I've got no cursor. But I don't see that slide. Okay. Oh, there we go. Bear with me. Okay. Where did it go? Okay. Do I need this, or can I use that? Okay. All right. Matt said to do good, all you need to, I think he said to do good, or for morality to operate without God, all you need is a desire to do good and a belief about what's good. That only works. My time was counting while I was setting up? Oh. A desire to do good with a belief about what's good. That only works if there is such a thing as good. You can do what you think is morality, but there's no great guarantee that it's morality unless good first exists, which I think, now he wasn't rebutting me in his opening statement, or at least I don't think he was trying to do that too much. But for that to be the case, to be able to have morality without God, there must be good without God. And that remains to be seen because of the is-ought problem. Basically, I think the house I gave was a cumulative case argument that it's dicey, it's challenging. The moral facts argument, I think, is a serious challenge to the idea that there's any moral facts whatsoever if nature is all that exists. And then the circularity problem creates what may potentially be an inescapable circular reasoning when it comes to acquiring moral knowledge. Now, he also said, you ought to do such and such if you feel compelled. That's a question of moral motivation, not a question of the metaphysics of whether good exists. Sociopaths could potentially have moral knowledge even if they lack the sentimental or the compassional side that would help motivate them to do what's right, just from sort of an instinctual, primitive level. Even if we don't have those, we could still potentially know what's right and do what's right without any feelings corresponding with it whatsoever. We could be morally numb. We could be on heavy medication and still do the right thing, even if we don't have any empathy motivating that. But again, that's dealing with motivation and not necessarily the epistemology or the metaphysics issue. He said the rules of chess are arbitrary, and after that point, you can have perhaps objectively better and worse moves. But because of that arbitrary basis, I think he's admitting exactly what I was pointing to in the problems with naturalistic, secularistic, atheistic, materialistic ethics. Now, he mentioned slavery, And that's one I hear a lot, and typically I hear it from people who haven't really done their history work to know what the Bible is actually saying. Matt and I actually argued. Now, he can read it just fine, and he's not a terrible hermeneuticist, if that's how it's pronounced, when he puts his mind to it. But does the Bible promote slavery? Permit? Yes. In a vastly different culture than ours. Promote? No. Biblical principles clearly identify liberty as the ideal. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery, Galatians 5:1. So if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. Do to others as you would have them do to you, and that probably doesn't include enslaving them. And see also Philemon 16:17. Scripture encourages people to escape slavery wherever it's possible. 1 Corinthians 7:21 and 23. Slavery was a punishment or a curse which should be avoided, according to Genesis 15:13, Isaiah 14:3, Jeremiah 34, Ezekiel 34:27. Scripture is relevant to all cultures and societies, not just abolitionist ones. To say that the Bible is wrong for having instruction for folks that are in a slavery society, to have instructions for them is somehow forbidden, is to dictate that Scripture only speak to societies that have the wherewithal to access the privileges that we take for granted now, which includes abolition. To demand Scripture only dictate abolition is to wish it were irrelevant for most of history and most every culture in history. Historical and literary context often undercut critical claims. Before passing judgment on ancient societies for answering their problems with slavery, you need to offer a better answer first. If you don't care to know the historical context, then you don't care what the passage means. Meaning is contextual. I had a back and forth with Matt on this subject a couple of years ago, which actually motivated me to do more extensive research. And at one point he actually said he doesn't care about the historical context. Well, then I would contend if you don't care about the historical context, then you don't care what the text means, because meaning is contextual. A hole-in-one means one thing on a golf course versus in a laundromat. Anachronistic fallacy. Reading contemporary sense of slavery, such as 19th century race-based chattel slavery, into every instance of the Greek is doulos, the Hebrew is ebed. Most of the slavery passages are casuistic, meaning they're case law. If this is going on, then here's what prescription follows. But it doesn't say that you should start there. It doesn't say that that case is something you should emulate. It just says if that case happens, here's how to mitigate the loss or the fallout or the problems from it. 5, Scripture opposes all sorts of oppression, be it physical or spiritual. 6, Scripture explicitly opposes/undermines different kinds of slavery. Chattel kidnapping was banned in Exodus 21:16. Runaway slaves were not to be returned to their masters, but were free to live where they want without oppression. It was presumed that they were being treated unjustly. Against war slavery in 2 Chronicles 28:8-15. There should be no poor among you, Deuteronomy 15:4, which would be an indictment against generating conditions that create debt slavery. Foreigners were especially provided for because they were especially vulnerable to debt slavery and wage slavery and things like that. Israel is warned against slaving practices which they endured in Egypt, race-based chattel slavery. Number 9, the Hebrew word ebed and Greek doulos both have a wider range of meaning than our typical sense of slave. Whenever someone says the Bible promotes slavery, I ask them, which sense of slavery are you talking about? Most contemporary critics have never thought about the 6 or 7 different kinds, most of which solve things like debt slavery, which if you've got a better solution, such as debtor's prison, in a society that doesn't have standing prisons, then I'm all ears. Propose something that solves the problem at a practical, boots-on-the-ground level, and then we can start talking. Number 10, the most common biblical instruction regarding slavery was an indictment against it, a cursed past, never worth repeating. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is the most common reference to slavery, and it's telling them as a warning, don't act like the cruel slave masters that you lived under. Don't be that. Don't create conditions that push people into that. Avoid that at all costs. If, as a case law, you end up in a situation where you've got warfare, which we can talk about that if you want to bring that up. In a case of warfare, slavery, by some arguments, under a Hebrew law, offered more liberty to people that would have been free, quote, free citizens in within their native people. And it offered a chance for people to assimilate into the victorious civilization and then have a life afterwards, as opposed to being killed, because prisoners of war were oftentimes killed because they're baggage when you're on a military campaign. Thank you so much.
Well, I guess I'll stand. That's fine. So maybe someday we'll actually have a debate about slavery, because I'm evidently not thinking about it properly. Because when I read the Bible, I read what it actually says, and I don't go cherry-picking verses that have nothing necessarily to do with slavery. The fact that you shouldn't allow yourself to be slaves is not a condemnation against slavery. The Bible says that you should buy your slaves from the heathen that surround you. Indentured servitude, by the way, is also grossly immoral, which the Bible should recognize. But John's biggest problem seems to be that I don't care about the historical context, and he's right. I don't. The thing is, it's silly. I have no way to look at this other than that this is a desperate attempt to try to rehabilitate something that is so obviously grossly immoral, and it would serve as a cannonball to destroy the foundations of somebody's moral foundations if they're pointing to the Bible. Because what's undeniable is that if we consider the context of the time, there were people who were eating shellfish and wearing mixed fabrics, and God was powerful enough and wise enough to make sure that there were proclamations in the Bible to prohibit the eating of shellfish and the wearing of mixed fabrics. So we don't have to, was God so weak that he could not say, don't own people as property? Instead, it says, own people as property. They are your money. You can beat them as long as they don't die within a couple days. You can pass them on to your children. How backward could you possibly get it? But, as I said when we were doing this earlier, this is not a debate about slavery. I'm not here to necessarily condemn the Bible, because it could be the case that there is a God who serves as the moral foundation that has nothing to do with the Bible or any avocation for slavery. All I'm saying is, the Bible permits it, which gets it exactly wrong, and somehow or another it was important to outlaw shellfish, so I'm eating sushi tomorrow. I don't care about the historical context, because we can in the past, you can have incorrect understandings of morality. We now benefit from the mistakes that other people have made in their understanding of morality. And so one of the things is, things may change over time. Something that used to be moral or immoral could change to be the opposite, if the circumstances change, if the nature of human beings change, et cetera. For example, if all of a sudden I evolved gills, then depriving me of oxygen, holding me underneath the water might not be as immoral. But it may still be immoral in the sense that you are imposing your will over somebody else's and violating their freedom and autonomy. These are the questions that we need to sort out. Now, John points out that this is only relevant if there is good. Well, good, in the sense that I'm using it, is that which achieves the goal. So it's only the goal. I don't think that good is something that exists out in the universe. I don't think the universe has any intrinsic good any more than it has an intrinsic ought. The problems that he's raising, I agree. There's no intrinsic ought and there's no intrinsic good in the universe. Good is an assessment that we make about the consequences of actions with respect to the goal. And if you don't care about the goal, obviously you couldn't call it good. So good doesn't exist in that sense. During his discussion, he talked about Christian universities abolishing slavery and building universities and things like that. And yes, religions, including Christianity, have done mountains of good for the world and mountains of harm. But first of all, we're comparing, in that particular sense, he was comparing Christianity to atheism and saying atheism was this barren wasteland, as if that was a fair comparison between the two. And then he goes on a moment later to say that atheism is just godlessness. It's not a worldview. Correct, it's not, which means atheism is in fact a barren wasteland. Oh my God, did you just agree with? Yes. Because the fair comparison is not Christianity versus atheism, it's Christianity versus secular humanism or secular morals. That is the fair comparison. And so when it's convenient, let me just put Christianity up against atheism. What has atheism done for us? Well, maybe not much. But there's also this privileged position that Christianity and other religions have had where they are exempt from taxes, where they have a privileged position in society, where they can build universities and hospitals. And there's not a single time in history where secular humanism has enjoyed that level of privilege to where it could do that. And despite this, despite the fact that religions had thousands of years of advantage, secular humanism is doing all of that stuff right now. One of the most prestigious colleges in London is headed up by Anthony Grayling. There are secular charities left for right, Foundation Beyond Belief. On Sundays in Austin, we work with atheists helping the homeless and secular humanists at work to feed the homeless without having to give them a sermon. The fact that we had to start from an underprivileged position and work to catch up is the thing to consider, because that's what we're doing. And the fact that Christianity and Christians, I think that's probably more accurate, Christians were critical in abolishing slavery doesn't tell you anything at all about whether or not Christianity is true. The fact that Christians can do good things, the fact that atheists can do good things, doesn't tell you anything at all about whether or not they're right or whether or not their moral foundation, whether the thing that they point to as their moral foundation, is real. It says that nature can't make moral claims true, but truth is that which is consistent with reality, as far as I'm concerned, and nature is reality. I'm not in any point arguing for an intrinsic should or a natural should. And there was a point where I had this conversation that he posted with John Loftus, where Loftus was talking about our brains lying to us. Our brains do lie to us. Our brains, we engage in self-deception. The wonderful thing is that we have the capacity and ability to tell when our brains are lying to us. We can discover optical illusions. We can discover things that have deceived us. When John says that our brains lie to us, that is not the equivalent of saying our brains cannot inform us about truth. The fact that, in John's view, our brains didn't evolve to find truth so much as to find that which allows us to evolve doesn't preclude truth, because finding truth helps us evolve. Finding truth helps us stay alive in the universe. Truth in the sense that this is real, this is consistent with reality. The ability to tell the difference between a rustling in the bushes, whether or not it's a tiger getting ready to jump me or just the wind. We can investigate. We have investigated. I'm sitting here, standing on a stage at one of the great universities. Oh, sorry, that's cheap. One of the greatest universities on the planet, talking to you through a microphone because of our understanding of electricity. It is possible that my brain is lying to me about a great many things right now, but it is also possible for me to research, investigate, and discover the truth. And we do that how? Not by merely relying on our own understanding, to paraphrase from a Bible, but by independent confirmation. And this is critical. This is how science is done. This is how we avoid self-deception. This is how we manage to minimize the effect of our biases. Independent confirmation. And when it comes to claims about morality and the moral foundations, secular moral systems like the one I'm advocating is all about independent confirmation. The data are the facts from reality that point to which world is better, the world that allows slavery or the world that doesn't. Because in the short term, slavery is incredibly beneficial to the slave owners. In the long term, it's bad for everybody. And in the short term, it can be good for a slave. Ooh, the Bible advocates for the really nice version of slavery, as long as the nice version of slavery is beating people if you want to, as long as they don't die. Now, I don't think anybody in this room, if you were the source of morality, could possibly get this as wrong as this, and then sprinkle other verses that other people have to interpret as saying, you know that thing where it says you can own people as property? That wasn't quite right. But we're not here for slavery. We're here for good. Thanks.
Great. The second question originally was going to have to do with objective morality. But as I already mentioned to both John and Matt, I've revised the question a little bit in light of what they've already said. So I have a question for each of you, a different question for each of you. I hope it's fair to ask it in this way. So the first one is for John. I feel like, is this too close to my mouth here? All right.
As long as it doesn't cover your face.
Okay. Here we go. So your position is that objective morality requires or is best explained by theism, the existence of God. Mm-hmm. Now, it's often recognized that moral properties are rather strange. they're not natural properties. Like at the macrophysical level, you don't find such a thing as wrongness. You find other kinds of interesting properties. So moral properties are rather unusual. So somebody might be motivated on those grounds to think, well, I don't think there are any objective properties. And if they think that way, they might be inclined to run your argument in the other direction and say, well, if objective morality requires the existence of God, there are these objective moral properties that are rather strange. I don't want to believe in them. So I'd rather just give up on objective morality.
Okay.
So what would you say to a moral relativist who said, I'm going to give up on objective morality because I think it's just too weird?
I might ask him if I can have his stereo, because if he doesn't believe that his ownership of that stereo constitutes some sort of, at least approximating an objective moral wrong, then I might want his stereo more than he's willing to stop me from taking it. And so I think at core, when it comes to moral relativism, moral objectivism, people tend to be relativists when it serves them, and they tend to be objectivists when it serves them. And most everybody, when you punch them in the face, they're an objectivist about how that was wrong. That wasn't just your instinct. That led me I was wondering about, as I was listening to Matt, I saw a lot of hints of relativism and didn't really see the kind of grounding or foundation to be able to pull back and escape the pitfalls typical of relativism. Although I grant that he considers his system to be some sort of moral objectivism, I just don't know what that means given the way he explained it. It sounded like relativism to me. And so if someone were appealing to relativism, it can be difficult. The moral argument for God's existence, which is part of what we're doing today, is in some ways it's really messy and very difficult to make work because it deals with stuff that it's kind of hard to prove. Like to know what is the good. I understand good in an Aristotelian sense. Good is that which is desirable for its own sake. And to say, why should I desire the good, is to say, why should I desire what you should desire for its own sake? That doesn't make sense. Why should I do what I should do? Well, because you should do it. I understand that to be the intrinsic nature of what good is. And I think there's a strong defense and a historical defense, not just in Christianity, but otherwise. If someone, however, doesn't want to grant that, I don't want to sound condescending, but I think that deserves pity more than an analytic argument. I think that kind of approach can suggest that a person is either not being honest about what they know, and at that point in the past I have asked, what are you so committed to that you're willing to release what I think is moral knowledge so you could hold on to this other thing? And people will do that. I could imagine myself doing that. That's not just other people. In moments of weak will, I could understand making a serious moral compromise because I want this thing so bad, or because I'm addicted, or because I'm in love, or something, one of the typical irrational excuses we use. That makes sense to me, not logically, but emotionally, because I'm a human being. So at that point, I don't know that I would use a straight-up philosophical argument to try to help a person leaning relativistically to. I mean, if you want, I got slides for it, but I assume you don't want that. I mean, there's a philosophical case to be made that relativism ends up in all kinds of outcomes that people probably don't really want. But I think the problem isn't so much a logical problem, though it may seem like that. I think they're underneath it. If they're really stuck in it, I think that there's a chance that there's more things going on than just a rational conclusion.
So am I on to...
Oh, I wanted to know how much time is that?
That was 5 minutes.
I don't think I'll need 5 minutes to respond to that. So for me, moral relativism is this notion that something is moral because a culture says it's moral. And I would agree with John that good for the sake of good is a kind of a difficult thing to sort through, but I'm not saying that in any way that I should do good because good is good. I'm saying if I care about doing good, then I should do good. And I'm not using should in the ought sense. It's more about this is how you achieve this goal. And I also agree that I could certainly rationalize justifications to do things. But I think that if push comes to shove and we would have a conversation about it, I would recognize that not only was I not doing good, but I probably didn't think I was doing good at the time. Hey, I'm going to do this because it suits me right now. And we probably know that we're not doing good. So the fact that I can rationalize stuff like that doesn't change whether or not something is or isn't good. And I'm only viewing good as, is the consequence of my action consistent with the goal of a better world, of well-being? And I think probably the most important concept, which hopefully everybody in the room is already familiar with, but if you're not, and you hear nothing else, hear this. John Rawls' veil of ignorance can be used to great effect in many different areas, but also with regard to morality. And in a short version, design the sort of world you're willing to live in, not knowing who you will be in that world. Should we allow slavery? Remember, you could come in as a slave owner or a slave or somebody who's neither. Which would you prefer? Design the world. This gets us to the most unbiased assessment of fairness we could possibly achieve. We're always going to be biased, but if you start with that, design the world you want to live in, not knowing who you're going to be. How much wealth is too much wealth for one person to have? Design the world with the economic system that you're willing to come in under, not knowing which end of the spectrum or where in the spectrum you might be. When I'm assessing moral situations, I ask myself a couple of different questions, and I do it with the knowledge that we don't have the answers to every moral quandary that we could. But one is, all right, how does this fit in with the veil of ignorance? And the other one is, if the entire world took the action that I'm contemplating, would we be better off or worse off? Or would it make any difference? Because I do recognize that there are things that maybe don't have any sort of, if the entire world ate chocolate ice cream instead of vanilla ice cream, well, there may be moral implications to that. Hey, if we're going to put people out of work or dramatically change economies, all of those things have an effect. You don't have the capacity to consider all of the potential consequences in a butterfly effect of your action, or all of the things that led to your action. So you have to do the best you can in the time allowed, with the information allowed. Do it with the understanding that you're probably going to get things wrong. But as long as you care about doing good, when somebody points out this thing that you thought was good actually isn't, and they make a case for it that is convincing, if you still care about doing good, you will not do that thing again. You will do the new thing that you now have a better understanding is good. This is where secular moral systems are superior in the sense that there is opportunity for progress. We're not reliant on ancient revealed wisdom. We are reliant on reason and pointing at the evidence. And nobody's pretending we have it all sorted out. But I know that if I was designing the world I want to come in to, slavery would not be a thing.
Thank you. So now I have a question that we will ask Matt first, and then John, you can respond as you will. And this will sound familiar because it's touching on something you've said several times, and even Matt has raised this. So you've said that you ought to do something. You have an ought. If you care, if I care, then I should do good. So this seems to suggest, and what I'd like you to clarify is whether and how or whether it doesn't suggest. It seems to suggest that whether I have a moral obligation depends upon whether I have certain psychological states or not. And the latter seems to be a rather contingent fact about me. So it seems like it's hard to see how we have objective moral obligations on this view. What we have is an objective fact about the conditional.
Yes.
If I've got desires, then I've got obligations. But there's no objective fact of the form, I have obligations.
Yeah, so this actually raises a curious thing for me because I've done a bunch of debates, and I remember one debate in particular that wasn't about morality, but morality always comes up, and it was with John. And I stated that I had a solution to the is-ought problem because you can't get to an ought from an is, but you can get to an ought from two is's. And John pointed out that all I was doing was smuggling in an ought as an is, and he was right, and I acknowledged it, and I dropped that. However, when I say, I agree with the assessment that you made, when I say the universe doesn't have any intrinsic ought, I mean it. There's no reason at all, there's no enforcement or desire or implication from the universe that I should care or ought to care about right behavior. And so it is a psychological component. It is entirely, I do in fact care about right behavior. However, it's not just a fluke, and it is not arbitrary. When I say that we all care about right behavior, I of course mean most of us. There are people who clearly couldn't give a rat's ass if they're acting in the right way. They have a number of psychological conditions that are going to be different from mine. But I'm convinced that you can get to altruism through purely selfish foundations, and that this desire that I have to do right may in fact be rooted in utter selfishness. And selfishness has gotten such a bad name. Oh, you're too selfish. You're so selfish. Why would you go with your selfish desires and everything else? Okay, let's say that I am selfish. Let's say that I am almost perfectly selfish. I share space with other people. My actions, the consequences of my actions have effects on them, and what they do has an effect on me. I have to share space. It is absolutely impractical for me to find any place on this planet to go be by myself, and it would be a bad idea anyway. We know this from game theory. We're reliant on each other. And so game theory alone, coupled with my selfishness, dictates that it is in my best interest to do good things because they benefit me. Why on earth would you go out and help somebody who's homeless? Because one of these days I might be homeless, and it's in my best interest for me to encourage the sort of world that helps homeless people. That's an utterly selfish motivation. Do I think that's the only one? No. I think that I'm the descendants of people who cared about people, and so when I care about somebody, it feels good. It was an evolutionary benefit for me to care about other people because I benefit from that. That way I don't get ostracized from the tribe. That way I'm not the one that's thrown out, that has to forage all the food and everything else and survive by myself, that has nobody to watch over them when they're asleep at night. I'm not saying that this is all the product of evolution, but it is about our psychological makeup, which is all about the fact that we have to share space with people. And if I think, and even if I were utterly selfish in almost the worst possible sense, you can still from there get to motivations to do good because it benefits you. That's the thing that some people overlook, is that, oh, well, why would you sacrifice your life for somebody else? Well, it may sound a little silly, but if I were to sacrifice myself, I've said before on stage, and by the way, I'm not meaning this to be insulting, this is a bit of a joke. Not completely, but it's a bit of a joke. Jesus didn't have any great sacrifice. He gave up a really bad weekend of what would be horrible torment for a regular human being, and then he got to go be co-equal with God for the rest of eternity. I will let you torture and kill me right now if there's a guarantee that it will end poverty and suffering throughout the planet forever. And you don't have to revive me and make me co-equal to God. That's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. Now, I have to acknowledge that one of the reasons I would say such a thing is because, man, if I did that, I probably would be lionized, statues, all this. Look at this great good Matt did. It's so much better than Jesus. But it's not the only motivation for saying it, because I honestly believe that that sort of change in society would be so beneficial to, I don't have offspring, but if I had my offspring, that could be a potential goal. I am the product of what makes me feel good to do this, and that's a good enough motivation for me.
So it sounds like the question, and correct me if I'm not paraphrasing you appropriately, but it sounds like you're asking about how psychological states translate into the question of moral objectivity. How do we have real moral objectivity, not just relativism, when there's so much of our psychological states involved in it? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay.
Did I not? Never mind, go ahead.
From what it sounded like, I'm still hearing egoism, ethical egoism, not necessarily psychological egoism, but though that's usually a part of it. Relative, a bunch of isms. I apologize to people who don't know these isms.
Defined egoism.
Egoism is a self-interested ethic, minimally. It could also say that your self-interest is somehow good, but some forms of egoism acknowledge that calling your self-interest good is a bit arbitrary at some point, because, yeah, it may help further the species, might serve your interest, but where did you get into morality and all of that? That's just describing how things work. And we're dealing in functional oughts, but not moral oughts. We're dealing in conditional morality, not categorical morality. If you're familiar with Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, good, we haven't entered morality until we're doing good for the sake of good, not for the sake of some other interest. When it becomes a conditional or a hypothetical imperative, that we're doing it for the sake of some arbitrary goal we have. We're not dealing in morality anymore. We're dealing in functionalism. And there's all sorts of things we can do that could function to, say, help the poor, improve someone's marriage, bless the community. But none of that's really telling us anything about morality, because that's just more description. That's just more of what is. Now, hear me. I commend atheists, secularists, skeptics who are doing altruistic things, who are going to soup kitchens. Good for you. I think that's good. I think we need more of that. And if we're going to disagree on religion and God belief forevermore, I expect some of that. At least we can be on the same page when it comes to helping others. I affirm that. But I think you happen to know that that's good. I happen to know that that's good. But I don't think that could even be good unless we get from the is to the ought. And I don't hear anything beyond combinations of psychology and interpersonal psychology that Matt's using to try to give us some grounding to know what's good and what's evil. He can only tell us, for example, if you want to be fair, then follow John Rawls' veil of ignorance, ascribe to that thought experiment. But what if you don't want to be fair? What if you're a really high-functioning sociopath? Now, that's an exceptional case, but that's a classic defeater for people that rely too much on motivation as the primary means for knowing good and evil. A person doesn't have to have any instinctual or primitive motivation to still be able to know what's right and wrong. A friend of mine, not a personal friend of mine, but an acquaintance, was chemical, I forget if it's psychopath or sociopath, but it seems like from birth he had a muted empathy response. But he still knew what he should do and shouldn't do. So even if your motivations are muted or in error, it's still possible to have moral knowledge. And I think the moral knowledge is possible because there can be moral facts. And there can only be moral facts if we figured out some way to bridge from the is to the ought. And so I'm trying to talk about something that helps us tell when someone doing good for good's sake is actually good versus doing good for the wrong sake, that's a mixed motive and there's evil swirled in there, might have good outcomes. But overall, I think you're right in saying that morality is messy. Ethics is messy. I'm not sure to what extent I agree that it's simple. You mentioned that in a different context, different setting. Psychologically speaking, I don't think human psychology is enough to get out of the punishing problems of relativism.
Are we allowed to ask quick questions?
Actually, we have 10 minutes before we're doing Q&A.
Okay.
And
I just might forget by then.
Okay. Well, you'll ask it. You'll get to ask it because the next 10 minutes each of you gets to ask one question of the other.
Okay.
So you do get to ask a question, but we have 5 minutes for it, and we got to be pretty strict about it. All right. 10 total. So you get to ask John a question, and then John, you get to ask Matt a question.
Okay.
You had a question?
Oh, we're doing that now?
Yeah, we're doing that now.
now.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, what's going on with your Facebook, though?
There was a picture of Facebook that my manager guy just sent me, which popped up over my notes, so I didn't get to take notes on my question.
I actually didn't see it. I was just playing with you.
Yeah. I don't think it's fair to fault a secular moral system for solving a problem that you haven't demonstrated is real, or one that you haven't demonstrated that your system actually solves it either, because I don't have any access to a God or what a God thinks or any of that. But the question is, if you and I go out at I-35 and 6th Street on some Sunday morning, and we both hand sandwiches to homeless people, we can both look at that and say, hey, we've done some good, we've done maybe equivalent good. What extent, when we're talking about morality, that's what I would view, is we've done something that's good, brought good to the world. It seems that you're saying, if you're doing it because you think God wants you to, and I'm doing it because I selfishly think it's a good thing, that somehow you're morally superior. Is that correct?
No.
Are they essentially morally equal then?
Maybe, maybe not. I mean, there's a lot going on there. I'm saying that.
Well, if we're uncertain, then isn't that an admission that the motivation isn't part of this evaluation of moral?
The uncertainty was in regards to a hypothetical situation. All things being equal, sure, they're equal, but I don't know that all things are being equal. But sure, for the sake of argument, it's equal. But I'm not saying. I think you're framing it in a way that's operating on a presumption that I don't have. In principle, an atheist and a theist, a Christian theist even, could be equally moral in doing the same thing. But it sounds like you're bringing in the word good, but you haven't shown that prescriptions even make sense on a naturalistic.
I don't view it as prescriptive. It's descriptive.
Oh, it's descriptive. So you're using a non-moral sense of good.
So if
a descriptive, not a prescriptive
what I use as a foundation
sense.
for morality is this concept of well-being, and what is good is what supports well-being. So it's a descriptive of my action.
Okay, so where about in nature or your frame of reference, your worldview, which includes atheism and secular humanism and so on, where about in there do you get a sense that humanity should survive? A prescription?
I've said, I don't know how many times tonight, I don't think there is such a prescription. I don't
Okay.
think there's any intrinsic requirement that we care about good or that we do good or that we survive.
Okay, so following with that then, if suppose a rapist is seriously deranged, he took a heavy blow in the head and his moral functioning's pretty off, but he's doing the best he can, and he thinks that if he were to exercise that rape instinct that he now has, it would somehow create a better world for everybody. But he's wrong. He believes it though. Is it good for him? But not other people.
He thinks
it's good for him.
good, but it is not good. We know that he's wrong. We can demonstrate that he's wrong.
So okay, we can demonstrate that he's wrong. If it's good for him, but he's not. It sounds like you said.
We can
you
demonstrate
added a
that
contingency. You added an if they're motivated to it. But what if they're not motivated to do it?
So this is the thing that you kind of faulted secular systems before. What do you do with somebody who's not motivated? And I mentioned this in my opening that I get this all the time. Well, why should I care about well-being? Well, there's no intrinsic motivation from the universe for you to care about well-being, but we do, and that's the foundation. I can say the same thing. Why should I care about morality? Why should I care about God? There's no motivation.
Because it's
requirement.
morality would be my answer. I think there's an irreducible truth
That's
about
just
it.
magic.
It's just magic.
To say I should care about morality because it's morality is just a magical circular assertion.
Ultimately, everything has a point at which asking further scrutiny of it is just proving your failure to understand what you're asking. Everything has irreducible levels at some point. Materially speaking, maybe there's something smaller than a quark, but potentially quarks are the irreducible element for, say, material. But when we come to other things, asking, why should I do what I should do is an incoherent question.
Let me interject. So, John, you have the option to ask a different question or continue
Okay.
this question. You have 5 minutes.
Let's see, I got to a couple of them already.
Well, he did ask questions during my.
I did.
I don't care,
If
John.
you want
You
him
know
to
I don't
ask,
care.
I mean, I don't have a ready question here. I mentioned, it sounds like you're kind of going where I was trying to lead, so I don't have any.
Well, we can keep going on this because.
Oh, I got a question.
Yes, go.
Here's a good one. Okay. Are you familiar with moral subjectivism or ethical subjectivism? And if so, please characterize it in your words. So we can
I'll just say
converse that.
no so that you can give the description you mean, and then I can assess it from there.
Okay, as I understand subjectivism, and I'm sure there's different senses of the term, it's kind of like when it comes to relativism, you've got moral facts are only true relative to some contingent reference point. So conventionalism is cultural relativism. Your reference point is culture. I'm doing what fits with this culture. Well, if a culture says exterminating Jews is okay, then it's good to exterminate Jews relative to that culture. And that's one of the classic rebuttals to cultural relativism. Subjectivism tends to have even less support, socially speaking, among ethicists. in part because it can make it even more subjective to the individual. So the reference point is our own subjective psychology. Do you ascribe to subjectivism in the sense that good is only what is good relative to features that are in my mind, in my psychology?
No.
Okay, can you clarify how that's not the case then?
Sure. As I mentioned, as physical beings in a physical universe, the laws of the universe dictate what is or isn't in my best interest. Through no subjective, it's objectively against my best interest for you to come over here and lop off my head right now. I would be dead. So that is against my well-being. And this is why, so I say I'm not a moral relativist because this is an appeal to culture. I'm not completely clear on the distinction between moral relativism and moral subjectivism, but essentially you seem to be
Same
tying
ballpark.
it to
There's
an
a lot in
individual
common.
psychology instead of the culture and the surrounding. Yeah. And I would reject both of those because so you've got the level of the individual for subjective, then the culture for relative. Okay. And then I would be going to something even bigger, which is even though well-being is far from thoroughly defined, it's not like we're completely clueless about what is and is not in our best interest. And so with something like slavery, we've seen how it affects societies. We know that by and large, a culture that allows slavery is going to end up worse off, both the slaves and the slave owners. Okay. So we are relying on that understanding about the facts of reality. It is not, I could say it's my personal opinion that slavery is a good thing, and we would be able to show that I was wrong by pointing to the data that show that slavery has been.
So it sounds like you're pointing to facts and data, but
Yes.
if you remember the dirty doorknob illustration.
Grab a paper towel.
Exactly. That's the solution, right? That's the solution. That's my point. You can't just use the dirty doorknob. You have to have something besides your brain, which has accumulated all the germs, has accumulated all the taints of evolutionary, naturalistic, and aimless processes.
I washed my hands with reason.
You need
and I grabbed a clean towel that was data. And I'm using that clean hand with data to open the doorknob.
Which would be wonderful if you were able to if you were able to access that doorknob and it not be, okay, my analogy is that doorknob is your brain. But you need something besides your brain to be able to get out, don't you? You need something besides your brain, but
No.
that paper towel now has to filter through your
data.
brain. The analogy is getting a little twisted here.
Yeah, you have the data, which is not my brain. The physical facts about what
Have
the
you
world
ever
is like and what's
accessed
happening.
data aside from your brain?
No.
That's my point.
Well, your
Have you
point is,
ever accessed objective facts
have you ever
besides
accessed
through your brain?
data besides through your brain?
What's that?
Have you ever accessed data besides through your
Yes,
brain?
through my mind. I'm not a naturalist. I don't agree with mind-brain identity theory.
Okay.
I'm a dualist.
I'll just let that sit then.
Yeah.
You're
This is a
exempt-
good time to switch to question
You're
Q&A.
exempt
Yeah.
because you're a dualist. Okay. You couldn't.
We could go into
Your
it.
brain believes
I just
you're a
introduced
dualist.
it.
Your
There's a whole debate about that, but we could go into that if you want.
Okay.
Sean, are you going to introduce the Q&A? Great.
So as Dr. Garcia just alluded to, we are having a Q&A section now. We have mics both here and here. We ask that if you do have a question, please approach the mics from the back. Don't try to go in front and then go behind it. Kind of the nature of it is we have been taking a few questions off of Twitter, so we're kind of going to oscillate between Twitter question, that mic, rinse and repeat. So if you do have a question, you can approach the mics now. Yep.
So we will start with a Twitter question while people are lining up at the mics, and that way they have to stand there longer and get more and more nervous about it. And also, please, if you're at the mic asking a question, ask a question. Don't give a little speech. Just being friendly here. Okay, so this is a question from Brooks, and it's for John. Do you believe morality should be derived from all of the Bible or only specific selections? And if so, which selections?
Which selections?
Let's go verse by verse.
Actually, I don't think morality should be derived strictly from the Bible, although I do grant that the whole Bible should be considered in context. I affirm natural revelation and special revelation. Natural revelation being knowledge we can have aside from, say, a revealed prophetic word or a miraculous event. But I believe one of the reasons why there's actually a high degree of agreement among skeptics, atheists, Muslims, Hindus, at least on some moral basics, is that I think we all have innate knowledge. That is indeed knowledge of facts that are properly basic. And to ask why should we do these things to a common person who isn't necessarily a grad student in philosophy will sound kind of like, why should we do what we should do? Well, obviously, I think our direct access to it is at least sufficient preliminary indication that we should recognize it as true. And so natural revelation, special revelation, and the rule of what's it called? Not the rule of thumb. Anyway, I think we should be fair to the whole scripture, not just proof text.
Great. Let's start with a question on this side.
All right. My question's for John mainly, and then I guess for Matt to respond to. What do you think of Christianity's evolving morality throughout history? So, like, Christian morality was not the same 2,000 years ago as it is today. Should it, if you think it's an objective morality, shouldn't it be unchanging and absolute?
Yes. I think if you read the whole of Scripture, not just proof text, as I pointed out, there's a libertine ideal where liberty is the ideal we should reach for as far as we can reach it. But if you have to do a whole lot of damage and wreck your family, ruin society, just to be able to reach your own liberty, then it might not necessarily be a net good, even though we recognize that slavery, all things considered, is reprehensible. I think Scripture still affirms that. But I think we have moral knowledge that is basic to us, and some of that at least points us in the right direction to where we're not all totally on a different page. There's enough agreement that we can have these kinds of conversations. Unfortunately, our moral knowledge and the facts to be able to correct them are the equivalent of the paper towel dispensers on the other side of the bathroom door. We have to open the door before we can get to the paper towels, and then we've tainted them again. Now, it'd be great if we didn't have to go back to the bathroom eventually and get our hands tainted again, because we have to use our brain with everything we do. But we can still have moral knowledge, because I don't think we're just brains and bodies. I don't think the materialist account is overall effective when it comes to things like consciousness, when it comes to things like moral knowledge.
God's a terrible bathroom designer. I could design a better bathroom. I could design a better world. Not without getting into the notion of whether or not we're in the best of all possible worlds. I find it really confusing that there's a God who has created us and stuck us down here and given us brains, although some of us think we have brains and minds, even though I don't know what the demonstration of that is. I have a dirty mind and a dirty brain, don't care. I think that the fact that what Christians view as moral now, that it's different from the past, is more a testament to the fact that the world's changing, which is one of the more robust aspects of a secular moral system. We're not tied to the past in order to kind of negotiate the past. We can correct it, and usually we can correct it a little quicker because we're relying on data that's on this side of that door. The problem with revelation, as Hume pointed out, is that it's necessarily first person, and to everybody else it's hearsay. And there's another problem with revelation in that not only do I not know how I could confirm that I've actually received revelation. As I mentioned before, I don't know how to tell the difference between someone who has and someone who thinks they have. But what do you do when you have two people who are convinced that they've got a revelation from God that points to two completely different conclusions? That's why Christianity has over 1,000 different denominations, and the Second Baptist Church can tell you why the First Baptist Church is wrong. The objection that people raise against secular morality is that there's no mechanism by which somebody should care about well-being or why you should require it. It's not fixed by appealing to a God. Well, there's no way to make sure that you can settle these disagreements about what is or isn't moral, because somebody can just say, nuh-uh. That's not fixed by appealing to a God either, because somebody else can say, nuh-uh, there is no God, and somebody else can say, nuh-uh, that's not what God said. So there's no apparent solution to this, but there are problems with the theistic model that I think are solved by the secular model. because we don't have the baggage and we don't have the revelation. What we have is a robust exploration of the universe, the effects, the consequences of our actions, and how that affects us, which is, I think, what we care about, even though some people seem to care about something special more added to morality.
Thank you. Let's take a question from this side.
Yeah, I have a question for Matt Dillahunty. So in your rebuttal speech, you expressed some sort of outrage over the past historical events of slavery, which I think we all find understandable. But I found your outrage somewhat confusing.
Okay.
Because I guess I interpret the emotion of outrage to be that things are clearly not as they should have been, or they're clearly inferior to how they could be, and we're angry and upset about that. Now, from your beliefs, it seems to be what you're saying, that moral obligations come from our caring about something. So because we care about human well-being, we are obligated to therefore do something about it, or we're obligated to follow some set of actions. So given that the slave owners clearly thought that it was somehow okay, that they didn't sense that there was any immediate obligation to relieve their slaves, is your outrage over the fact that they were doing something that you just inherently perceived to be wrong? Or was your outrage over the fact that they so badly miscalculated what was in their own interests?
Oh, good. Thank you. This is actually kind of easy and will be incredibly telling and probably divide the audience even more. My outrage has nothing to do with the fact that they were wrong about slavery. My outrage has to do with the fact that the Bible is wrong about slavery, and yet the Bible is held up as a moral guide from the moral author of the universe. And when I talk to people, instead of admitting that the Bible, when it says that you can own people as property, is advocating for something immoral, instead of acknowledging that, which, by the way, Ray Comfort's response to this was essentially, I don't believe everything in the Bible. I believe that there was stuff in the Bible that people got wrong. That would be a great response. They got it wrong. Instead, what I get from many apologists is, hey, the Bible didn't get it wrong. You're just not really studying it enough, or you haven't really considered what it has to say. You're not considering the context. You haven't looked at these other verses over here. I've looked at all the verses many times. And I am completely confident that if I were God, which is, by the way, the title of my new book, which is not out yet, but it's, if I were God and I were going to do the stupid thing of communicating with people in languages that would die out and change, I might not get everything right, but I would never inspire or write a verse that expressly permitted something immoral. It is patently absurd to outlaw clothing of different fabrics and shellfish. It is patently absurd to place women as second-tier citizens. It is patently absurd to make all of those claims and to endorse and allow slavery and to have two sets of rules. There's a separate set of rules for Jewish slaves than there are for non-Jewish slaves. Jewish slaves, you have to let them go after 7 years unless you trick them by giving them a family, in which case they become your property forever. So the Bible even tells you how you can trick your Jewish slaves into becoming your permanent slaves. The outrage is that this is so obviously, clearly immoral to every person walking the earth right now with a brain. And yet people will bend over backwards to make excuses for it rather than just saying, yeah, it's immoral, the Bible didn't get everything right, which would seem to be a much more honest and reasonable response that would allow us to have a conversation beyond that. But as long as they're going to just try to defend it, I can't do that conversation.
John?
There's a lot going on there. I think the core of your question, a lot of it's still unaddressed, though you did help clarify exactly what your outrage is, and it's you think the Bible, the way you understand the Bible is reprehensible. I agree that the way you understand the Bible is reprehensible, but there are. Let's see, how can I clarify this? The slavery. There might be more slaves today in America. Now, it's hard to count slaves because, pimps and den wardens and whatnot aren't exactly answering census questions or anything like that. But there might be more slaves in America today than there were in 1862 or 1860 or 1850 because of wage slavery and sex trafficking. And the irony of it is, and this is what I've seen as I studied history, and I haven't found anyone who has been able to rebut this, as much as Matt wants to lambast the Bible because of its instruction on slavery. What instruction do you give society to people who live in societies that aren't going to abolish slavery for hundreds of years? How do you give them counsel? Those are cultures that Scripture's relevant to, that Enlightenment humanism probably doesn't seem to have an answer to. Yet Scripture has not only that answer, but it testifies in the examples I gave to the ideal that as far as we're able, we should be striving for liberty. We should be striving to abolish slavery. And that's what we've seen in history. That's why hundreds of countries have abolished slavery, but only after they have been Christianized. I don't know of any that had to become majority atheists first before they abolished slavery. From what if you know any, I mean, I'm not a historian. If you know any, I'd be interested.
I don't know any.
Yeah.
I just think this is completely irrelevant.
But what we're talking about is in the real world, boots on the ground, slavery gets abolished with Christianity, with this book that you hate so much.
Not with the book.
Was that?
Not with the book, the people.
Let's move to the next question over here.
Howdy, this one's from Matt. So we seem to be using a very strict definition of God and more of a formulaic, this is a religion, look at Christianity as a building a church. But it seems that you sort of just taken an abstract, like well-being, made that your God, and then you're trying to build up a sort of common law religion around that on how to act and whatnot. And I guess second part is, in that common law, if self-interest is the only or one of the main guiding tenets, then wouldn't self-interest be different, say, for a king than a serf? And then you could train morality into serfs if it's in their best interest not to get killed, and maybe a king would have in his best interest to perpetuate his kingdom, but maintain his kingship. So.
Sure. So when you say that I've turned well-being into my God, no offense, but that tells me a lot about where you're coming from, because I didn't turn well-being into a God. I could believe that there's a God. I could be a Christian who believes and worships a God and still care about well-being. The reason I stop at well-being is basically Occam's razor. Hey, I care about me, I care about this, I care about that, I care about well-being. Does God care about my well-being? Is there any evidence that any God ever has cared about what's in my best interest? Now, you've raised a really difficult issue. And this is one that comes up when we start talking about well-being as a foundation. The conflict between what is apparently in my best interest versus what is in the community's best interest or somebody else's best interest, and when those things come in conflict. And that is, in fact, a real problem. I'm not claiming that the stuff has been solved. However, in most of those situations, when we get down to it, what's happened is someone is convinced about what is apparently in their immediate interest, and they're just a little too myopic to see the broader base, because if you are the king and it's in your best interest to expand your community, what are the consequences of that? Maybe you should treat the people better rather than having them be serfs, rather than having them poor. Right? Maybe you should be building universities that allow them to better your kingdom and make your kingdom better. And then maybe at some point you should make alliances with other kingdoms because you benefit from this as well. And maybe at some point you'll realize that instead of having a king in charge of that kingdom, that sort of dictatorial view is not necessarily in the best interest, and you broaden out and, oh, wait a minute, I'm talking about the history of the world.
Well, that would also apply to politicians versus mechanics.
Sure. What's that? Democracy is the worst system, or the best system, except, or whatever.
Worst system except for all the others.
Except for all the others. Yes, there you go.
Yeah.
John, you want to jump in here?
So well-being potentially could be relative to class distinctions if well-being, if class distinctions had a similar foundational standing as well-being and our moral duty to it. I don't know that they are, so I'm not quite sure that I tend to affirm general humanitarian principles of equal rights from creation onward. And we know biologically that that the creation of an individual, biologically distinct individual human being, biologically speaking, is at conception. So I would affirm equal rights from conception onward, at least as so far as they're accessible. And that thing at least has life, so that they may not have, a driver's license, but they have life. And so that seems like something that a humanitarian society would work to at least reduce. I think even pro-choicers would be able to say that abortion is not necessarily some celebratory great thing, and it'd be better if we could kind of reduce the circumstances that generate abortion and maybe reduce abortions. But you mentioned Occam's razor, last point. Occam's razor, I think, is great if you're not using it to avoid the full consequences of your system. And I think when we apply the dirty doorknob and the mirror, we find that secular ethics doesn't necessarily get deep enough to ground this kind of stuff, so that we're dealing in facts about reality instead of facts about mentality.
Okay. Here's what we're going to do, or here's what I've been told we're going to do. For the next questions, they're going to be directed at a single person, and there's only going to be one of you that gets to respond. So, too bad.
Two quick things for that.
What do you got?
This is a question for Mr. Dillahunty. My question was, what is your take on the is-ought problem? Do you think it's a problem? And how do you approach it?
I think as it's been presented, it's a legitimate problem that I don't have any solution for. And since I have 2 minutes, first of all, the notion that secular morality doesn't go far enough, which was one of the comments you say, that may be true. It goes as far as I can reasonably see us going. I think you want to extend things beyond what we can reasonably do. But that's the whole reason we're doing a debate. And not to turn this into a debate on abortion, and there's somebody who's going to say, Matt, you should have stopped talking.
You should have stopped talking.
I'm fine with the notion of granting equal rights for a fetus within reason, as you're talking. But the people who are opposed to abortion aren't granting equal rights to fetuses. They're granting special rights to fetus. They're granting it to the right to use someone else's body without their consent.
Next question.
This question is also directed at Mr. Dillahunty. There's a popular short story, Those Who Walk Away from Ameles, by Ursula Le Guin, that imagines a society of maximum human flourishing predicated on the abuse of one individual or the complete trampling of one. I guess, would that be a moral system inside your framework? Or another way of asking it is slavery only immoral because it's not an economically winning strategy?
Yeah, I think I think that example is dishonest, because it begins by excluding the one person from the whole and saying that this is the maximal flourishing of the whole. But that one person is part of the whole, and this is why I would rely on the veil of ignorance. You know, we could maximally flourish maybe if we killed everybody except for the 8 most adept people in the world. But we're going to be done after a generation because they're all going to be women. Sorry, I had to add a little joke in there like that. It's probably true. The fact that we may be myopic in assessing what is maximally good or whatever, I think that the idea of a utopia can drive us towards betterment, but never achievement of a utopia, because we're flawed. And the second we're willing to say, this person isn't part of the whole, if we can sacrifice them to benefit the whole, I think we've missed the point.
Thank you.
Next.
Matt, your moral framework seems to be grounded in the axiom of well-being. And you also conceded that not everyone may share that axiom. And I agree on both counts. So given that, how does your moral framework, or does your moral framework, give you any authority to tell someone else what they ought or ought not do, and why?
It doesn't give me any authority. What it does is it gives me the ammunition to attempt to convince them. The difference between most theistic models and secular models is that secular models, this problem of how do you change minds, it's done through discussion, debate, and data. And through theistic models, it tends to be done through coercion and conversion. And that's one of the reasons why I view it as superior. I don't claim any moral authority. But what I may have, if I may have justification, and matter of fact, I would argue that I perhaps do have a justification and an obligation to engage others beyond discussion. I'm not a pacifist. If a country is engaged in gross human rights violations where we're convinced they're wrong, I think that can be sufficient justification to take action. The fact that we don't agree, it doesn't change whether or not we believe in a God or not. It's not solved by, God told me you were wrong, or the data told me you're wrong. We still have to make some kind of action.
Hopefully this is a question for John, but we'll find out.
Sorry. Another question.
I'll be
for
quicker then.
Mr. Dillahunty.
Do you have one for John?
So
It's okay.
you refer to a sort of objective data to determine morality. Is it historical data that you're referring to?
In some cases, I mean, when we look at how societies have flourished, technically, okay, all data is historical, but we know some things about what is and is not in our best interest. We basically have a good understanding that individual liberty and bodily autonomy and those freedoms allow nations to flourish more than caste-based systems, even though they may be more ordered. In most cases, the factors that you would have to consider are so incredibly complex that we may not be anywhere near the right answer, the one true answer to rule them all, but we can identify clearly wrong answers or a relative comparison between answers that are better or worse. And so a friend of mine put it this way: in any given situation, and I'm talking about situation being the primary thing you consider when you're evaluating an action, in any given situation, there are a finite set of actions I could take. And we know that some set of one or more actions lead to a better world under any number of objective standards, and some set of actions I could take lead to a worse world. We may not know which of those is best. We may not even have access to the best. When Sam Harris describes this as the moral landscape, we are now on perhaps, hopefully, a higher plateau to see more broadly the landscape, to pick out the next high point and move our way towards that, if that makes sense.
Hi, my question is for Matt. Sorry.
I
Matt,
swear I didn't set him up to do it this way.
I'm going to let both of them respond. And
sounds good.
Okay.
Matt, I have followed your trajectory and have to say that your arguments and ideas have helped me in the process of figuring out my stances on morality. So thank you for your input.
Thank you.
And my question is, I've noticed that your strategy for conversing about these sort of topics have gone from a more passionate and intense tone, like in your radio talk show, to a more relaxed and parsimonious approach. What experiences made you change?
I guess that can't be a question for John, too.
I'm going to tell you why this question's so ironic, because on Sunday there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm human, and I had a pretty bad day and was clearly moody. And as soon as the show, I do a live call-in show, and as soon as the show was over, I got 3 or 4 emails, which, despite the fact that there are thousands of people watch it, I am neurotic enough that I care what those 3 or 4 people actually had to say. And not only did I make a mistake and basically completely mistreat someone, I got something in the Bible wrong and told him he had it wrong and hung up and was like, go study your Bible. And then as soon as I said it, I was like, ooh, is that right? And then somebody emailed and they're like, you're wrong, dude. And I was an ass to a couple of people. And so one of the things is people will watch clips from the show and get an impression of me. And it depends on which clips you watch. In the 14 plus years I've done the show, you can put together a montage of me being a dick. Like, oh my gosh, does this guy ever do anything but call people names and hang up on them? Because I've done that. You could also put together a really long clip of me being incredibly patient and marching through this. I didn't intentionally make a change to my style. I do acknowledge, and I think, well, I don't know how much of the show John's watched, but there's a different tact when I'm on stage in public than there is on the show. And that's because when you're on a show, you got time constraints. I got 6 callers waiting. This call isn't necessarily good enough when I'm on stage. This is, well, I was going to say the best I'm going to get, but it's good, or I wouldn't have accepted it in the first place. John is somebody that I want to talk to and want to have long conversations with in front of people. And because of that, it's in my best interest to work this way. And it's in the best interest for everybody else, because this is somebody's first introduction to atheism. This is somebody's first introduction to secular humanism. And if I'm up here and the only thing they leave with is, oh my God, this jackass made fun of Jesus giving up a weekend and was just snarky and everything, then I have failed.
John,
and I don't want to fail.
Obviously, I can't speak for Matt's evolving personality over time, but I do hope someone finds a GIF of him pointing to me and saying, "This is the best I'm going to get." I want a GIF of that I can use. That's awesome. I think there's a humanitarian impetus that if you're not learning it over time, then you're not paying attention, and you're bringing bad assumptions or some sort of defect to the table. We should be growing in our sensitivities to others. We should be growing in our ability to recognize what other people are going through. Just this weekend, I'm coming from a funeral. My wife's sister passed away from stage 4 cancer. And I can't think of how many times as a young man I would give some glib proof text from Scripture saying, all things work together for the good of those who love Him. I'll pray for you, buddy, and then move on. But when you actually have life experience, you come to realize you can develop your empathic response like you're working a muscle. Practice can grow that in you. And if you have any willingness to be self-aware, you'll realize that you can always improve. Occasionally I'll hear people say, oh, I don't have any regrets. And I want to tell them, well, you're an idiot if you don't. If you could have never done anything better than you did in the past, if you don't have anything that you wish you could unsay, then either you're not paying attention or you're just deluded. Because there's always ways we can be improving. And a lot of that is, I'm finding for me, this is as a husband, as a grown man, a lot of my improving is learning when to shut up. Learning when to answer with a hug. Oh, yeah, shut up, yeah.
I'll completely agree. And the only caveat,
shut up.
I'll shut up.
Yeah. We have one more question, and then we're going to let each of you, after you answer this question, if we still have time, we'll each give you a chance to do a brief closing statement. And we'll let you know how long.
We should end the night
I've got a slide for that.
Analogy from John, so we can't get his analogies too clear, right? So, John, you said you can't just use your washed hand to open the doorknob, that you need something else. Matt agreed with you and said just use a paper towel. My question to you, John, is as a Christian, what would you say that something else is?
What would I say that something else is? As a Christian, I'm not restricted to a strictly materialist understanding of the human being. One of the benefits of being a Christian is I hold to a supernaturalist worldview. I can embrace all the vindications of naturalism. I can embrace all of the achievements of science insofar as they're describing the natural world, how things are in this present reality and all that. But I don't have to stop there. I can keep asking questions. I can keep digging deeper, even when I run up to a hard spot that reductivism, materialism, ismism, when those aren't solving it anymore, I can still keep asking questions. And some of those questions that I can keep asking include the is-ought fallacy, and how do we get around it? How do we solve this problem of the circularity of our brains, and how I have to use my brain to access data that's supposed to help me discern what's wrong with my brain, and so on. And I can use questions like that. I suggest we have immaterial souls that inform our bodies, similar to how information informs language. It's called Thomistic hylomorphism. That's a big, long word that basically means you are a body-soul unity. You're not a soul in a body. You are a soulish body. And that way we have some account for things like consciousness, which David Chalmers talks about, the hard problem of consciousness, which drove him away from simple materialism. And he's one of the world-class, one of the top-level philosophers of mind. But that immaterial aspect of us makes sense in part because I don't think ultimate reality is material. I think ultimate reality behind all of material is mind. And our minds can potentially reflect the mind of God sometimes, at least insofar as we can have moral knowledge of facts, just as He does.
Great.
Yes, it's Jesus.
Okay.
Yeah.
For simple-minded Christians, that would
Yes.
be my...
Yes.
Thank you for the questions. We have time for short closing comments. How long should we give them? So each have 3 minutes for
3 minutes? Oh, wow.
your closing statement.
I didn't expect as much.
I believe we start with John.
Okay.
Yeah. Please keep your eyes on that paper that Zach has.
Okay.
Tell you when to be quiet.
I want to affirm a lot of what Matt said. I don't want to come out as sound like I'm strictly a contrarian, like all the things he agrees with me on, like I'm not noticing them. I do believe that morality is very complicated. It's very messy, and I think it's a stopgap sometimes when we say Occam's razor. We shouldn't complicate it more than we need to. I think the fact that we don't have a resolution to things like the is-ought problem and the circularity problem, those are reasons why we shouldn't say Occam's razor, let's simplify, let's stop here. That's a good reason to keep pressing on. And if our materialism is forcing us to weird conclusions, and I think we might have heard some today, but I'll have to go back and make sure I heard you correctly, because I'm not sure. I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're saying there. Morality is messy, even in a Christian framework, and there's lots of disagreement. I grant all of that. The only thing I hope to accomplish ultimately with this moderated dialogue / debate was to establish that for there to exist good, we need morality. I'm sorry, we need a moral basis for facts, and that points us to God. Classic moral facts argument as I developed it. I think Christianity on the whole has a superior account. I think the proof's in the pudding. Historically, you see the vindications of successful Christian societies. Now, you see a lot of messy stuff, too. You see the Crusades, you see the Salem witch trials, you see people twisting Scripture into something that denies people access to liberty when it's right there in arm's reach, and acting as if those passages aren't in Scripture. You still see that sometimes because, unfortunately, the church is populated by people, and we're on the wrong side of heaven if you're looking for perfection. So I'm not judging the society according to utopia. Matt mentioned utopianism earlier. I think the worst, most grave atrocities we've seen in world history have been foisted on mankind in the name of achieving utopia. Wanting utopia here under natural resources, using governmental systems, using individual liberties, we don't end up in utopia. We end up in dictatorships or anarchy. We end up in a lot of gross problems. But fortunately, we've got a lot of correctives in society. Even atheists can still have moral knowledge, but I don't think they can get that moral knowledge from nature. And many Christians are able to build on that with a framework of moral knowledge so we can interact with it through, say, the Ten Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount, and at least some guiding principles that can help us understand this. I don't think we should be dumb about it. I think we need to make sure we're interpreting it correctly, and we need to take historical context very seriously. Otherwise, we're not concerned about what the text really means. Thank you.
So Occam's razor wasn't used to declare a stopping point at all. There's nothing, John talks about how he doesn't have to stop asking questions. Well, neither do I, neither does anybody else. If anything, religions have stopped questions and science has not stopped questions. Doesn't mean all religion stops all questions or anything else. Occam's razor was only used because of Hume's axiom, which is to reject the greater miracle, and Occam's razor to not multiply entities necessarily. It doesn't mean that stopping at the point where I'm forced to stop out of necessity doesn't mean I'm stopped there forever. The second that there is sufficient evidence to warrant belief in a God that is a foundation, or to even accept that there is something special and beyond about morality, I can accept that. But I don't get to go there just because I want that to be the case. And so I agree with him in the sense that he's defining good when he says that for good to exist, there must be whatever foundation. I don't think good exists in the context that he's defining it to exist. I don't think that good exists as a thing. I don't think good exists as a universal imperative or some type of intrinsic quality within the universe or some sort of ought-like motivation. Good, as I pointed out, is a descriptive label of how we view consequences with respect to the goal. And it's not a subjective thing in which, I think it's good. It is, does this correspond to this? It's like grabbing a ruler and saying, yes, we have declared arbitrarily this is 12 inches, and then walking up and measuring this table with it. It doesn't matter if the universe cared about inches or proclaimed some sort of standard by which we measure. We can still objectively determine what the height of this table is through completely arbitrary means because we're doing it in that context, and it doesn't change just because we want it to. And to complain that there's no universal standard of measure unless there's a God who declared that there's an inch is an inch is no more impactful than saying that it was a king's finger knuckle that declared an inch. The foundations can be arbitrary. The goals can be subjective. The assessment of the consequences of actions with respect to those goals is non-subjective. In the same way that when you make a move in chess, no matter how good you thought it was, has no bearing on whether or not it was a good move. And we can objectively assess whether or not moves we're making are good. If that's not what you mean by morality, then we're talking about two different things. I'm talking about well-being. I'm talking about the type of society we live in and how we proceed and whether or not we're in a better world or a worse world. That's what I care about. If you don't think that's morality, then we are talking about two different things. And all I care about is, do you also care about a better world?
It kind of beat me to the punch of giving a round of applause to our people. Can we give one more round of applause? Thank you. Just one more.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.